Hello everyone, and welcome to this session on revised expectations, technologies, productivity, promise, and the future of work. My name is Natasha McCarthy, and I'll be moderating today. So this session is sponsored by Sage, and Tech UK would like to thank them for supporting this important conversation about the impacts that tech has on work. So I'm a head of policy at the Royal Society, and I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and about the aims of this session before handing over to our excellent speakers. At the Royal Society, which is the UK's National Academy of Sciences, we do lots of work to recognise excellence in science and bring science to the public. And a major area of work for us is looking at data and digital technology policy. So what do digital technologies mean for people in society? We do a lot of work around questions such as, how do we have the right governance in place to use data ethically and in a way that is fair and inclusive? We think about the role of technologies like cybersecurity and privacy enhancing technologies to make sure that we're using technology safely, that we're doing things like enabling well-governed access to data so that we can unlock the promise of data whilst minimizing harms and risks to people and organizations. We're also really interested in what data and digital technology can do in terms of addressing some major policy challenges at the moment. So for example, what is the role of data and digital technology in helping us to reach net zero? So we've got a broad sort of area of work on data and digital technology policy, and an absolutely kind of constant theme of that work is, what does all of this mean for skills and what does this mean for work? So for example, we're interested in how do technologies such as AI change the workplace? What does AI mean for how jobs might change in the future? Jobs that may no longer be needed because they can be dealt with by AI technologies, or jobs that will change because people need to work more with data analysis, or work with autonomous systems more. We're interested in the demand for data science skills. That seems to be growing across sectors, internationally, across regions. How are those kind of demands met? How do we make sure everybody has an opportunity to engage in the jobs that are created by that demand for data science skills and the ability to use data across all different sectors? And in particular, sectors such as health, environment, climate change, they all are going to be changed by using data and digital technology more. So what does that mean for people working in those sectors? What does that mean for the skills and the jobs that are needed in those sectors? So because I have those sorts of interests in the area of work that the Royal Society is doing, I'm really, really pleased to be moderating this session today. We'll be talking about questions such as, has the productivity promise of tech been realized? So we've all heard a lot about what tech might be able to do in the workplace, what it might mean for businesses, but have we seen that come to pass? And in fact, when there is that productivity benefit, when there are productivity gains, are they shared fairly across the society? We'll also think about whether some of the more negative impacts of tech in the workplace have come to pass and what employers and others can do to ensure that everybody thrives in the workplace. And we want to think about, how can everybody be prepared for and engage in the economy of the future? How do we make sure people have the ability to take on the kind of skills and training work to be able to access roles that will be beneficial for everyone? So those are the sorts of questions we'll be looking at today. We've got an absolutely great set of panelists to talk to all of that. So I'm joined today by Anna Thomas, who's co-founder and director for the Institute for the Future of Work. RIhanna Saty, who's co-founder and CEO for MiVite. Aaron Harris, Chief Technology Officer at Sage. Matt Warman, MP. And Andrew Pakes, Director of Communications and Research at the Prospect Union. So I'll be going to each of our wonderful panelists in turn, asking them to introduce themselves and their work and give some initial reflections on this question about revised expectations, technology's productivity promise, and the future of work. We'll then go into a conversation with some deeper questions, and we'd really like to involve the audience there. So please do add any questions you have to the panelists to the Q&A function. And so I will now go on to our excellent speakers, starting with Anna Thomas. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for that introduction, and thank you to Tech UK for having me for this very important and timely discussion on technology and productivity. I'm director of the Institute for the Future of Work, which is a research and development institute exploring the changing world of work and building practical solutions to help people thrive. That means increasing prosperity and increasing well-being by thinking about work more closely and improving work across the country. We set it up in the nick of time before the pandemic with a Nobelist economist, Chris Pissarades, and a technologist, Naomi Kleiner. So to the question, so technology is essentially about doing more with less. And so yes, as a general rule, it should underpin productivity growth. But there are risks and costs to people, especially at the sharper end of transitions, that must be addressed on the way. And those risks have been highlighted and some exacerbated through the pandemic. There's a clear social and moral case for this, which is gaining traction, but there's also a growing economic and innovation case for it, which I hope to cover a bit in this discussion. So we know that new demands and incentives have increased investment in tech and digitalization through the pandemic, even where other areas of activity are much weaker, information technology in particular, and we've seen that in the last load of statistics from the ONS and firm surveys. Our Future of Work Commission identified 5 factors determining the extent and pace of tech adoption: necessity, cost, labour, investment, and acceptance. And we've seen those change through the pandemic and various trade-offs being made in different ways by different firms across the country. Overall, it means there's huge potential for increase in productivity. It's there in spades, although it has not yet been realised. And we would say that it depends what you do with it, how it's implemented, and in particular what policies, including regulation, are in place. Our future and the future of work in particular is not predetermined. In the UK, dispersal is not even, we know that, across firms, sectors, or regions of the country, and it's not having the same outcomes for people either. That's important because productivity gains depend on actual implementation and doing it well. And history tells us that different groups of people are at higher risk of the adverse impacts of automation and digitization. Also that the benefits are not automatically spread, they're not evenly spread, and that you do need policy intervention to ensure tech transition in the public interest. In the UK in particular, we're good at innovation, but we're not so good at dispersal. Our work on the Global Labour Resilience Index bore that out. We have particularly high levels of polarisation and division in our labour markets, and all sorts of different inequalities, many of which intersect and some of which are growing. We're not great yet at vocational training or reskilling in spite of recent boosts. And actually some recent research suggests that larger firms in particular have reduced their training through the pandemic at just the point that it's needed most. That's not good, because we know that to be really successful, to maximise opportunities and minimise risks, you need to invest in people, their skills and capabilities, as well as physical capital. You need both together working for the best outcomes. But more than that, our research is tending to show that a focus on work impacts and good work right the way through the technology innovation cycle and deployment cycle is the best way to align what can feel like competing interests to get the best outcomes now and for the future. And you can think about that horizontally, from R&D investment through design, procurement, and deployment. The earlier you think about it, the better results you're likely to be. And you can also see that vertically for individuals, firms, and at national and policy level. For example, our Good Work Monitor shows that good work correlates with better outcomes of different sorts through COVID, including less furlough, less unemployment, even fewer mortalities, and death of disease and diseases of despair, which suggests that good work should be a overarching objective. Rather than an afterthought. And we know too that good work, especially satisfaction and well-being, correlates closely with higher performance and better innovation. So this approach invites more nuanced thinking about AI and labour productivity that really consider and forefront impacts on work and people and good work. And values good work and their benefits, not just for workers, but for communities, firms, and the wider society too. And that slightly challenges the traditional idea that the closer integration of technology with human labour you are, the higher your economic terms will necessarily be. Our research in the Amazonian era, the gigification of work, for example, pointed to a much more complex relationship between tech and people, and 6 types of automation, not just substitution, all of which had positive or negative impacts on work and work quality. Looking at the time, I'm going to go straight on to what should we do about it, and perhaps come back to some details there in our discussion, Natasha. What should we do about it? Hopefully I've made the case for good work to be an overarching policy objective. We should also, we think, have a good work, future of work strategy at the same time as the AI strategy, as a way of thinking more closely about the impacts on work and making sure we're planning for the future as well as now. But in particular, I want to flag our recent work on algorithmic impact assessments, which interestingly aligns with the CDI assurance map released this morning, especially the demand for assurance across the AI supply chain and the importance and need to understand risks and accountability too. And we've put out detailed proposals for how that could be and mark part of an overarching framework and duty for corporations forefronting thinking about impacts on work. Thank you very much.
Anna, many thanks. That was a lot of very interesting insights to get us going. I think we'll be really interested to dig into that concept of good work and how we can put it at the forefront of policy making and practice. And yeah, really interested to sort of dig into those 6 types of automation as well. So next, over to you, RIhan.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and completely agree with your points, Anna. Really insightful there as well. So my name is RIhanna Saty. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a technology company called MeVitae, but I'm also really grateful to sit on the council and be a member of the Skills and our Diversity member as well. And our aim at MeVitae is to help organisations mitigate biases, specifically in the hiring process. By biases, I'm referring to cognitive biases, but also algorithmic biases. I come from a kind of world of academia, of neuroscience, and trying to understand how people make decisions. And of course, that impacts every choice that we ever make, thanks to our human brain. And there's, from the questions that you've kind of recruited to, it's such a fully loaded question, but I'm going to try my best to answer these. And I think the kind of goal or aim that we're trying to work on is the ability to kind of use digital skills, regardless of our environment, and making sure it's as future-proof as possible. And by that, I mean, it kind of relates down to building a cohesive strategy, but also making sure from in the world of HR and we're in, ensuring that we have the culture for that as well. The ability to be able to take in this technology, be able to utilize it and scale with it, whilst making sure it's as fair as possible for everyone involved. Because we need to be able to try and democratize it and be able to make sure that everyone has a fairer chance and be able to use it and utilize it. And so there needs to be a strategy and an approach to that. And over the years, we've, especially with the classic C word of Corona, that's had such a big impact. It's accelerated the use of technology in the workplace, the use of hybrid working. And as a result of that, the demand of global mobility has also shot up. The ability to work from anywhere and be able to take talent regardless and be able to utilize that, and making sure that we have the technology to take that into account as well. And there's a terminology that we use in our organization called augmented intelligence. And that kind of term stems from the concept of there's a lot of information out there about the replacing of people with jobs, right? Machines are going to automate a lot of jobs. So there's a lot of studies around that. In fact, Oxford University has one already on that. And our stance here at MeVitae is that there is, of course, going to be jobs that are going to be replaced, but also jobs that are going to be created. And it shouldn't be a war of one versus the other, you know, man versus machine. But the concept of the unity between the two, the concept of man plus machine, and being able to utilize that and optimize that to be able to automate some of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis that machines can help us with. And I'll give you an example in the world that we're in HR. So for example, when we are, a lot of employers will look at resumes and screen those applications and decide who to put through to the next step. And there are lots of kind of challenges associated to that, right? Time, cost, efficiency, etc. And we can use technology and utilize it to be able to try and help shortlist, right? Of course, trying to mitigate, again, the algorithmic biases and cognitive biases that humans make. But that's an example of not necessarily having to replace people, but be able to try and make sure that we're utilizing technology as best as possible. But I'd also say that there's no technology or solution that will solve everything. We need to think about the use cases of why we're using technology and enabling it in the workplace, right? There's going to be different tools, processes, and making sure that organizations have these in place. We're not just using technology for the sake of using technology, of course. And therefore, one of the things that we've seen has been really useful is kind of understanding what the key challenges kind of organizations have or face, and understand what are the use cases and where are the gaps associated to that. Do they have the skills in-house to be able to accommodate for these things? Do they need to procure technology, and making sure you're accounting for the risks associated to that and mitigating these risks as well, and making sure that they understand the challenges, the internal resources, and how does that impact the culture of an organization? How does that impact the retention of talent as well? And all of these factors need to be taken into account. And of course, it's not just the responsibility of the organization, but also policies involved in this. Education, upskilling talent is going to be an important area as well, of making sure that we have the skills, because there's always a skill gap, right? There is always going to be the demand, which is going to increase, of the use of technology, whether it be cybersecurity, data science, and being able to ensure that we can either upskill our current talent to do that, or do we have to look at other means? And so there's quite a lot of fully loaded components to that, and I'm sure we'll get into it as well. But that's just a few points.
Great, thank you, Rhiam. And I think it's really interesting, isn't it, to point out that a long-term issue of culture change in workplaces versus what happened very rapidly in the pandemic, where lots of people's working lives changed quite quickly and they started using technologies in quite different ways. So now over to you, Erin, for your points.
Great, thank you. It's so great to be with you all today. This is a really, really important topic for us. And I've got to say, it's a bit humbling to follow somebody like Rhiam, who's got the courage to start a business that's directly tackling these issues. It's really impressive to me. So as Natasha said, I'm Aaron Harris. I'm the CTO of Sage. We're the leading provider of cloud financial accounting, people, and payroll products for small and medium businesses. We're headquartered in the UK, but I'm coming to you from New England in the US. So we are quite a global business. And we have this very provocative, I think, purpose at Sage, which is to knock down barriers so everyone can thrive, which implied in that purpose is this idea that we are elevating the work of humans. We are enabling technology to create the automation we need for small and medium businesses to really be successful. My job as the CTO is to define the technology strategy to enable that purpose. And I've got a really brilliant team of engineers and data scientists and designers that are building the enabling technologies that are going to support the products and the solutions and the services we need to build to achieve that purpose. And as I thought about your questions, the one thing that just kept coming back to me was that trust underpins all of this. And I want to start with a story that I think illuminates one of the key points here. I was talking to a small business in the UK. They provide gardening stones and paver stones to residential customers. And it was a family-owned business. So the husband runs distribution and the wife does the bookkeeping. And I was talking to the wife about her use of the software. And one of the things that occurred to me was that she could be much more productive if she was using our bank feeds capability. It's really simple. We digitally access bank feeds, we download them, we reconcile, the work is done. I asked her if she was using it. She said no. I asked why. She said, because I don't trust it. And if you think about that, if she doesn't get the bank reconciliation correct, it means that they don't have a view on their cash flow. And for a small business, that's a death sentence, right? So she has to have absolute confidence in the technology. And there's a lot to support that. We've got to make it easy. We've got to make it explainable. We've got to have a bit of humility to know when technology can achieve something with 100% confidence and when a human needs to get involved. But we have to tackle this notion that technology needs to be trusted. The second element to me is we believe we can use technology to create trust. So what if that small business didn't actually need to reconcile their bank statements? What if all of the payments happened digitally on a blockchain network where payments were settled instantly, where there was perfect trust in the transactions? So how can we use technology to create trust in our markets and create trust for small businesses in the way they interact with their customers and their suppliers? And then the last thing I would say is that there's a real deficit of trust in technology businesses. As a creator of technology, we have to be trusted. As we look at all of our ambitions with Sage, the biggest opportunity we have is to leverage the data that our customers store in our products to create powerful AI ML solutions, to create powerful data solutions. But we only have access to that data through the support of our customers, right? Through the trust of our customers. And so we have to continually display to our customers in the way that we behave, in the way that we explain our technology, through our agreements, that we will never violate their trust in pursuit of using data to create these solutions. So, the quick recap for me on all of this is, if we really hope to achieve our objectives with productivity, to elevate human work with technology, the technology has to be trusted. We have to look for opportunities to use technology to create trust. And we, as the organizations that create these solutions using technology, we also have to be trusted.
Thank you very much. And I think that's really nice in tying this session to the overall question of the summit around digital ethics and data ethics. How do you create these technologies in a trustworthy way and use data to do that in a trustworthy way? Really interesting themes. Now over to you, Matt.
Thanks. It's always hard to come at the end of a session like this when everyone has said so many interesting things. But I suppose what I would start by saying is, obviously from a government perspective, all of the aspects of the future of work do depend on connectivity. And that is something that itself is not evenly spread across the country and across society as things stand at the moment. So that is a sort of foundational thing to fix. Second to that, I think there's the fact that if you say to someone, what do you think about the future of work? Some people will think about the precariousness of work. Some people will think about skills. Some people will think about connectivity. Some people will think about what that means for the future of the high street. Some people will worry about the absence of their job because they might fear it's going to be replaced by the kind of technologies that we've talked about. So the extent to which this is an enormously wide-ranging conversation, and where all of it is underpinned by the need to get the ethics of it right, which I appreciate covers quite a lot, is enormous. And there isn't yet, I think, any kind of consensus in any one of those strands, which makes the government's role in pulling it all together into a coherent strategy something that is immensely difficult. Although, as a couple of people have said, I don't necessarily dispute the fact that shouldn't put you off giving it a go. So I think there are some really important issues that are there. I think the fundamental thing for me, though, comes back to the sort of dual question of governance and of what does an ethical framework look like. And I think of those as two separate things, in the sense that there will inevitably be some new requirements around governance that particularly will look towards the future of data, that sort of thing. I think those are interesting questions that we can get into in the discussion, perhaps. There's then a separate question, I think, over what does it look like if you start talking about the the implications of the essential absence of the application of a lot of existing legislation on the internet already. Now, some people, the obvious example of that is around the online harms and Facebook and all that, but the other side of it is around equality and discrimination when it comes to building the algorithms that are going to be increasingly important. And how do you apply the Equalities Act, which is, I think, a perfectly good set of principles on which to build in a world where the understanding of what might be happening is immensely more complicated than that piece of legislation was ever intended to deal with. And then the point I'll end on, because I'm conscious of time, but the point I'll end on, I suppose, is simply to say, for the vast majority of people, the future of their individual job is likely to be that it will be increasingly augmented by technology rather than replaced by it. Even if I think people have been sort of saying that black cab drivers should fear for their livelihoods for quite some time now, and actually all that's happened is black cab drivers have all got really good, to some extent, AI-assisted navigation sat on their dashboard. And I think that will continue to be the story of AI in particular for a long time. That will be an assistive technology, but it will, as we drive up productivity through that means, potentially mean that there are fewer people required in any given sector, or that the people in those sectors will require far greater skills than they have previously had. So I would end where several people have sort of begun, which is that skills is the most important thing that we can focus on around all of this, I think, because it is what will allow people to move with the times rather than to, as we've seen in previous industrial revolutions, see workers clinging on to a job that they don't want to change because they know how to do it, but therefore they find less and less of it. And that you can go back to the early 19th century, you can go back to a whole host of other examples where you had incredibly skilled people essentially waiting for the next contract. They wouldn't have necessarily thought of it as a contract, but the next commission, and finding that they were just earning less and less, doing less and less, because rather than sort of jumping 2 feet in to the next technological revolution, they were unable to see what was happening. And I think that really does talk to Aaron's point about making sure that people trust those technologies, making sure that they buy into them, and making sure that people are able to, as individuals as well as part of society, to really benefit from the much greater productivity that the future of work should offer all of us if we get it right.
Great, thank you. And it's really helpful to have in mind the breadth of issues that come under the question of the future of work, the breadth of jobs that are affected, and all the different ways that we need to address that. So now over to you, Andrew, for your comments.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Natasha, for that. I think I have drawn the short straw since we've had some brilliant contributions so far. But I really welcome the Minister's, I think, recognition and extrapolation of this as a really broad, different set of issues that we're trying to grapple with. I think it's really good that Tech UK continues to have a focus on skills and work. But it's not just a digital technology issue, it's industrial policy or industrial strategy, it's a place policy, it's about not just levelling up, but levelling across different communities, and it's about economic power and where things happen in countries in the international economy, and trying to bring those things together. So I'm going to try not to repeat, but probably share with you 4 different just quick reflections, which I think add to that in terms of how we do it. I should say I'm Andrew Pakes. I'm Research Director and one of the Deputy General Secretaries of Prospect. We're an independent trade union. We represent around 150,000 skilled engineering, data and tech type workers, both people who are involved in the development of AI and coding, as well as those people who are seeing their jobs augmented. And to me, I really like this focus on productivity, because I think that begins to be the center of our Venn diagram there. And what I've always been struck in doing my job over the last few years is that when we look at other countries that have higher levels of productivity than we do, you can begin to see a real clear correlation in the data of it. And that correlation is between those countries which have a higher level of automation and technical adoption also tend to have a higher level of worker involvement in their economy. There's a sense of social partnership there. And just about every competitor the UK has that sense of there is greater worker involvement, not just for unions, it can be through SMEs, it can be works councils, it can be about different forms of staff forums, but the kind of co-production model is something post-Brexit, facing the future as we think about what do we want the British model to be about. We would always argue that good work element needs to be located in that. So here are my 4 quick reflections of things I'd like to see in 2022. Feels like that time of year to be doing predictions or reflections. Firstly, I'd really like to see a greater focus, I think, on cooperation and partnership in how we develop some of these debates. I think we need, as I think the Minister was alluding to, a more grounded discussion on governance and ethics as 2 separate issues. I worry that too often people feel change is done to them, whether that's politically or economically or in the labour market. There's a brilliant phrase we often use, which we borrowed from the disability movement, which is nothing about us without us. And I think that gives a good watchword in terms of all terms of change management, which is essentially what we're talking about. How do people feel involved in it? And consistently, when we've surveyed our members, and our members overall are really optimistic about the ability of technology to transform their work experiences, to liberate drudgery and allow them to focus on higher value, higher level things. But in this space of technology, there is consistently around 2/3 of people are not sure how their data is being used, particularly in the HR analytics space. But more importantly, or worrying for us, around the same level, 2/3 of people feel that if technology is to transform their job and it leads to productivity benefits, they don't believe they will see any of the benefits themselves. They believe it will go to the bottom line or it will go to shareholders. And that really worries me because it begins to use technology to reinforce a lack of trust that this is a shared endeavor in terms of that. So that's the first reflection. How do we get that? And we're doing that. We work with a range of big employers and small employers at the moment, making sure the spirit of GDPR works, looking at what consultation does, designing tech forums and others where brilliant employers can work with their brilliant workforce to try and iron out some of these problems before the level of implementation. And I was really pleased to see the CDI recruitment industry guidelines yesterday, which came out, I think, through the department, which recognise that role of involving people early, thinking about consequences, recognising unions and workers have a voice in this, was a really good aspect from government. Secondly, I think we should have a new focus on social benefits of technology. I think we need to storytell better, all of us, about people understanding what this means for their jobs, their livelihoods, and that fits together. And I think sometimes we regard this debate as around how the technology works, or we often think of it as about products, AI as a product, whereas I see it often as a process. So when you do product assessments, you think of it at the point of use, the point of design. But I think that product element means we sometimes miss the other elements. So if you're assessing a product, you think about your customers, you think about the initial use. What we know is that lots of this software is procured in by businesses, particularly in the world of monitoring and other software that's coming in, and it changes its function through time. So if you're doing it as product, then it's understanding who is your user. Is the user the workforce that enables it or might be managed it? Is the user your final use, who you're selling your product or service to? And I think we sometimes have too much of an instrumental view or narrow view of what that kind of product or sense is, when actually we need to be looking at something broader, which fits closer to what Anna's talked about in terms of the good work agenda. Thirdly, I think we need to pick up on our thing. What I would like to see, and I think our members like to see, is this sense of a high productivity, high engagement, high prosperity economy. And I think we can share that with politicians across all parties of how we get there. In terms of doing that, I think we need to hear much, much more about job transformation. Too much of the skills debate is focused on a really important element, which is the next generation in schools. But the vast majority of our 2030 workforce are already in workspaces already. And understanding people's anxiety, understanding the model of skills change and the economic policy around that is really important. And the public are not stupid. And the public will not treat politicians of any colour well if they treat them as stupid. I think people fear, particularly outside of some of our big engines and cities, that if old jobs disappear, they fear the new jobs will be lower skilled, less secure and less well paid. And we need to have a real conversation about the place as well as the people, and tell people about what those jobs will be and have that tough debate. And I think that goes to the heart of the levelling up agenda, but it also goes to the heart of how we have debate. We represent lots of members in nuclear energy, and we often talk about just transition. It's a known concept. I think we need just transition in digital so that people can see themselves and understand what jobs and things mean to them. And if I can be cheeky a little bit to the minister, I don't think the AI strategy picks up on that. And so I probably would like to see a very distinct stream in digital technology and AI that talks about work. What is the story of work within technology? And I think there's elements in it, but I think it needs to coalesce in the role people have, not just innovation and investment, but the downstream of that, what it means for our livelihoods and where people see themselves into it. And finally, just to finally things, I think we need to recognise the limits of privacy. And we've talked about that already, because too much of our law under GDPR, which is the main lens we look through this, is around individual rights. And we've alluded to things like equality, the Equality Act and other impacts of it. If we solely look at technology's impact on individuals, and that's what lots of the AI discussion does and lots of the ethics discussion does, we negate the communal experience of it. And particularly in the work experience, if you have a bad algorithm that makes a racist decision, it will rarely affect just one individual. It will affect them because of a shared characteristic they have. If you're going to automate or augment a work production line, it will affect a range of people who work on that. And I think we sometimes limit our discussions around individuals rather than shared interests. So we very much support the work of the all-party group on the future of work, the work of the Institute for Work, and things around AI Accountability Act. Ensuring algorithms are accountable to people, I think, strikes me as the balance of how we get that right. Because I think it goes back to one of the very first points, which is there is no single point at which technology happens. There is a whole data life cycle from recruitment through to product design, through to shared improvement, through to the end of it. In the same way, and we find this, you can now have powerful technology which can hire us, it can manage us, it can reward us, it can discipline us, and ultimately it can even fire people. Often with questions of trust at every stage, and sometimes without any perceivable human involvement in that. And I think there is a huge shared benefit between all of us in society as a whole if we can get that right. And I suppose that's a positive spirit we have. There is a mission creep on much of this technology, but underneath it all, there is something great for this country around our future prosperity if we involve all the right people in those decisions.
Andrew, many thanks, and lots of sort of stimulating points to pick up on there. We've just got just over 10 minutes for discussion, but I wonder if, because Andrew spoke directly to the Minister there, I wonder if he might go to you first for some reflections, specifically on how government can ensure that the future of work features in strategies such as the AI strategy and other areas such as the net zero roadmap and strategy, but also thinking about, as you say, a strategy for the future of work. It is a large scale thing, it covers many issues. What particular roles for government and policy making do you see? So your views on that would be most welcome.
No, thank you. I mean, it's interesting. I'm not the minister for this now, but I was until fairly recently. And one of the things that we were wrestling with, I suppose, with the AI strategy was how do you both make it a genuine strategy for AI as opposed to an enormous great here is how AI may affect absolutely everything in the world. Versus how do you make sure it is compatible? If I can put it as, how do you make sure it is compatible with the enormous range of things that AI will inevitably affect? And what we were broadly looking at, sort of foundationally, was making sure that we had the skills base for something that is a huge coming thing of ever greater importance to the economy. The AI strategy sort of talks to the ethical dimension, but it doesn't itself lay it out, if that makes sense. And I think what government, as I saw it at the time, has got the immense difficulty of, you have got separate government departments doing separate things, and that is an inevitable part of the scale that government has to operate on. But you have to make sure that everything is pulling in the same direction and everything is doing is going from the same hymn sheet. If you look at what we've just done with the drug strategy, for instance, it is the two big virtues of it, and I appreciate this won't appear immediately relevant, but bear with me. The two really big things about that strategy for something that has been a perennial problem for decades and decades and decades is to say the success for this program looks like government working together. It looks like genuine, meaningful coordination across government, and it is a 10-year plan. Now, I'm not sure you can quite do the same thing for AI on the 10-year plan level, because you do need a bit more agility, I think, in some ways, but perhaps not in others. But what you definitely need is that coordination across government. And I think it's not right to sort of pick on the AI strategy and say, well, it should be doing more. Because you could say that about every government strategy, and you could always say that you should be doing more. But I do think it definitely needs to manifest the same outcomes by coordinating deftly with all those other bits of government. So it's an immense challenge to get government to go all in the same direction, all on the same timescale, all at once. But I can definitely say from personal experience that that's what we were very keen to make happen.
Great, thank you. And absolutely, that kind of coordinated, joined up approach is so essential in policy making in this area. Moving on from the role of government, thinking about the role of employers ensuring that technology is adopted safely. We've highlighted in this conversation there are some really major debates that will go on for some time, but technology is being adopted every day. How can we make sure that employers have the right support and advice in doing that in a way that is safe and that is beneficial to people in the workplace? What support could employers access to make sure that they're doing that in a way that it doesn't have unintended consequences? Can I come to you first on that, Anna?
Yes, of course. And I did really enjoy those presentations from everyone. Thank you. Thanks so much. And I'm particularly delighted to be beaten by the Minister to talking about equality in this area, which is so important, and which in fact I will loop back to in answer to your question, Natasha. I mean, we have put proposals to meet some of these new opportunities as well as risks. One for a unified, overarching algorithmic impact assessment to really be the foundation, as Andrew has set out, of regulation, and looking at work really sharply shows what we have to do in high stakes environments, and also why a purely sectoral approach certainly won't be enough, although undoubtedly detailed guidance will be needed in addition to an overarching regime. But to answer your question more directly, that points to companies being able to adopt this approach of a voluntary impact assessment that incorporates equality, as the Minister has highlighted, data protection, but also other forms of impact, knowing the limitations, and then engaging stakeholders and affected communities, as Andrew has highlighted, and then making reasonable and proportionate adjustments in the circumstances voluntarily before the law comes, I think would be the best approach foremost. And on just the equality point, if I may quickly, the Minister's absolutely right to highlight the importance of equality. We've done a very detailed analysis and case studies about how some of these challenges, though, can get caught between the frameworks, the Equality Act and the data protection regime in particular, and that individual rights, which is the sort of foundation for most of those regimes, are not enough to capture those sort of intersectional, those collective harms that we've all spoken to in slightly different ways. And so what we need to do, we think, is really focus and highlight on the human decision making throughout the innovation cycle, from the design and right the way through, and think preemptively about the impacts, including in particular the impacts on equality, as the Minister has highlighted, and the impacts on work, as Andrew and others have highlighted. And then make sensible proportionate steps to mitigate those problems. And that's particularly important when a lot of these technologies are trained on data sets that reflect past patterns of resource and behaviour, and therefore without such a sort of slightly more interventionist preemptive approach, they will project these patterns into the future.
Thank you, Anna. That's a really interesting point. I guess the question is, how do you learn from good practice as opposed to learn from experience that might have been poor practice in the past? Andrew, would you like to add to that question?
Yeah, I definitely support the work Anna's talked about. Yeah. Look, I can kind of understand how employers can sometimes find the landscape confusing. We're talking about fast-moving technology. We're talking about a set of different laws which don't fit together. So is it health and safety law? Is it data protection? Is it employment rights? Is it equality law? And I think there's a space to try and pull this together, given the seismic nature that data will have on our future working patterns and how we work across all job types and all locations. Something that brings that together, I would argue that would give us transparency, and that's part of agency that I think our members would like to have about their working lives. But it brings that point together, as Anna's described, in terms of that sense of how do you pull things in. And I think it's really important to preempt, isn't it? It's about managing risks and harms and maximizing the benefits. So we've got some really good examples of members we work with where things like GPS tracking, other forms of technology are absolutely instrumental, particularly if they're working out on sites on the front line, instrumental to keeping them safe and well. That if you can't answer your phone or get in contact, someone knows where you are. Yeah, but we've equally made sure that's been negotiated so it works for people. What we also know is the same technology could be used to monitor and track people. And you can have bad bosses looking at where the people are and doing that invasive micromanagement, but it's exactly the same technology. So it's about understanding impacts and how things can be used, getting people involved early enough and asking people, and whether it's the traditional shop floor or the digital shop floor, the field of work, I suppose we'd always argue the sooner you involve people in co-design, quicker you identify the risks, but actually the better ideas you'll unleash. This idea that talents only exist just in investors or the high level misrepresents the talents of this country and the ability of people, I think, to co-create their futures. And to me, that's the really, really exciting bit. And when I speak to business leaders in Scandinavia, in Germany, lots of these questions are asked really differently because there is a sense of social partnership. There is a sense that employers want to work with their workforce to get things done. And it's about people getting on. And we have that in large parts of this country, but it's not even. And to me, it's how do we even up that experience so that, if change is happening, people can see themselves in it.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from Rhian and Aaron before we finish. Rhian, if I might come to you first, that point of kind of co-development ideas, co-production, in particular around kind of understanding skills needs. How do we make sure we bring the right range of voices together to understand skills needs and how they're best developed and delivered? What's your view on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try and tie it into actually Andrew's comment as well. As you might have seen on the CDI's report, they had a report actually mentioned about the ICO's kind of framework that they're building. And one of the things that we actually reached out to the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, because one of the things that we were very cautious of at the very beginning is privacy, data being used, especially in HR, for transparency, trust's sake. And so we reached out to the ICO and said to them, can you do an audit of our AI, right? Of what we're doing. And there's certain things that we were assessed on, and I'd recommend all employers to kind of consider them as well, which touches upon some of the things that we've discussed about. And I wanted to list some of those and how they also relate to the skills as well in your question, Natasha, if that's okay. So some of the things that was taken into account is, of course, governance and transparency, understanding what policies that we as employers have and individual rights within the data being used, especially with GDPR and the lawful basis attached to that. Looking into data minimization, right? The data being used, why is it being used? Is it necessary to be used? And what the impact that has on training sets, right? And that's an important, the concept of data and the need for skills in the data world is increasing over time. And so that's a very important thing that employers should take into account. The training is another factor, right? What training do existing employees in an organization have around security and policies, right? What training do they have around building technology and making sure that it's built as fairly as possible, but understanding, and there's you cannot be completely fair, but what's the truth? What's the basis for that? And understanding that, understanding the risks and understanding how do we try and mitigate these risks? And then making sure that all employees and the stakeholders in the organization understand those and the trade-offs attached to that as well is another thing. And then the other kind of other areas to consider, which also relates to your question, Natasha, is understanding statistical accuracy, understanding when AI is being built or technology is being built, what the outcomes and what the source of the data is, what the status of the data is, and making sure we take that into consideration. And that's a conversation that all organizations should have. Whether they should have, employees designated to trying to mitigate algorithmic biases when building technology. And that's going to be an important thing, especially in the future of work as we're adopting new technology. And then the last kind of two I'd kind of touch upon is discrimination and bias. And we've kind of touched and alluded to this conversation. When a system is being built, what the impact that has on the choices we make. And the choices and the decisions that kind of come out of that, and making sure that we're kind of future-proofing that as much as possible, which relates to the data. And so these are some of the things that we were assessed on, and I'd recommend that employers and organizations also look into those, because they're quite important factors for making sure that we're building not technology for today, but for tomorrow, right? And 5 years and 10 years down the line. And so having those kind of frameworks set in place is going to be important, and making sure you have the skills, whether in-house or having the resources to account for those, is going to be key. And I think that's one of the things that employers should look into when they're utilizing technology, and making sure that they're accounting for those, so that we can be transparent, we can be kind of provide the trust that organizations need.
Thank you so much. So I'd really like to hear some closing thoughts from Aaron. You might want to reflect on the comments other people have made, but also it was really interesting to hear your particular story about the kinds of organizations adopting tech and the decisions they have to go through and how they might be different for different sides of organizations. So your thoughts as we close be most welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And this has all just been fantastic. I've learned a lot just by listening to each of you. I guess I would close with two things. The first is, and you might find this hard to believe, we get tremendous benefit as a business that creates technology from governments and institutions who create regulations, who create guidelines for how technology is used and deployed and how we safeguard data. We get benefit from that because ultimately that gets back to my original point. It creates trust. And when small and medium businesses have trust that technology providers are adhering to these guidelines and principles and regulations, it makes it easier for them to make decisions about using technology in their businesses. And then, I would add to that, there's a real opportunity now to create sort of equal access to technology, whereas in the past, technology was really only accessible in its full extent to large enterprises who had the skills, who had sort of the support mechanisms, who had the breadth of capabilities to adopt technology, in large part because technology was inaccessible, it was hard to implement, it was sometimes hard to use, so it needed special skills. If we can commit to creating technology that is accessible, meaning it's easy to use, meaning that it's delivered in a way that interacts with the right, in the form that the users need to use it, but also that's delivered in business models that are more tied to the value it delivers. So you're not delivering big enterprise licenses to a small business. A small business can use that same technology in a pay-as-you-go sort of mechanism. So trust as created by the relationship we have with governments and other regulatory bodies, tied with accessibility, is really what's going to enable everybody to benefit from the productivity gains that I think technology really can deliver.
Thank you so much. And thanks again to Sage for sponsoring this session, but thank you so much to our excellent panelists, really rich discussion, so many really important thoughts to consider. And thanks so much for your time. So for everybody listening, you can hop right over now to the main plenary session on regulation, assurance and auditing. We've heard about the role of assurance today. So looking at the role that different approaches to governance will play in the future of trustworthy AI. And you can get to that session by going to the agenda tab on the left-hand menu. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again to our speakers. That's an excellent session.